Hello. People are joining in as we go live. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. As people roll in, I'm Elliot Mendes with Democratic Majority for Israel. Thank you for being with us. We have a fantastic program for you this afternoon to provide the latest and greatest on the political machinations as Israel seeks to form a government with a fantastic panel. Before we get started, I want to invite you to follow us on social media. You can see our handle and all the platforms that we're on below. So please take a follow. And now it is my pleasure to turn it over to introduce our panel this afternoon to DMFI's board co-chair, Ann Lewis. Ann, please take it away.
Hello, everyone. I am so pleased to be able to welcome Amy Spiro, who is the digital editor and Jerusalem correspondent at Jewish Insider. And before joining JI, Amy was editor and culture reporter for the Jerusalem Post and a reporter at New York Jewish Week. She has written for Variety, Tablet Magazine, several other publications, and was featured on the Jewish Telegraph Agency's Top 50 Twitter list, a list we all aspire to. Amy received her Bachelor of Arts in Journalism and Politics from NYU, and you can follow her, speaking of Twitter, you can follow her at Amy Spiro. We're also thrilled to have with us the Deputy Managing Editor of the Jerusalem Post, Tovah Lazaroff. Having worked at the Post for over 20 years, Tovah has reported and covered and written extensively on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, including terrorist attacks, border disputes, hostage swaps, as well as Israeli foreign relations, including the U.S.-Israel relationship. Before moving to Israel and joining the Jerusalem Post, Tovah was a local reporter in Boston, earning multiple rewards from the New England Press Association and the Massachusetts Press Association. And she got her Bachelor of Arts in History from Brandeis University. And so now she's in Israel, where history is being made all around her. You can follow her on Twitter at Tovah Lazaroff.
Thank you, Ann. We're going to have an opportunity for everyone to ask questions. If you have questions, please feel free to use the feature at the bottom of Zoom, or if you're just watching on Facebook, to just put them into the chat there, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. We'll start with just kind of opening statements and thoughts. Tovah, we'll go to you first.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. So since this is, a Democratic group or people who are leaning Democratic, I want to say that if you're looking, at the Israeli election scene and thinking that there is some hope that some kind of a left-wing government might be formed that would work with the Biden administration, I think that would be at this moment a fantasy. I think what we're looking at is actually a lot of unity on the Israeli political scene in terms of thought, which is, in this case, it would be a right-wing, mostly government that, in fact, if you could get all the right-wing parties together, and if you took Lieberman out of that and you had, if you had Smotrich and then you had Netanyahu and you had Bennett and you had New Hope, Gideon Sa'ar, and you had the Haredi parties, you would be at 65. Not only would you be at 65, it would be an incredibly stable government. It could probably last for a few years. And the only reason that that isn't happening is because the right is divided. And some of what they're divided about is, in fact, Netanyahu. The number of right-wing parties that are opposing Netanyahu are growing, but there are not enough of them. So Netanyahu can't have a majority, and they don't have a majority without him, but they won't come together. So any other scenario that you look at, all these other scenarios that people are talking about, with the exception of a few way out ones, might give you a government, right? But that government, it's not like a choice as it used to be. Like, remember those days when we wanted to know, would it be a Likud-led government or a labor-led government? And then we knew what we were having, right? We were going right, we were going left. Now the opposite camp is so divided because you don't have a left-wing majority anymore, that even, let's say Netanyahu can't form a government, and in the easy case scenario, it moves over to Lapid or some kind of a Lapid government or rotation prime minister or a Bennett option, it's not a group of parties that are united in any way. So the chances that they would last would be very small. So what I think you're really looking at as you move forward is, can the right unite enough to form a government, or are you going to another set of elections? Now, it might not happen right away. You might get a government, but don't breathe easy. Don't get excited about that, because the next thing you're going to see is that government very soon will fall. And then you'll just be back in the election cycle. And that's because at the end of the day, what you haven't done is unified enough forces for a stable government. And you just want to think back to last year when we had a government with Gantz, and that government was still more closely aligned than any other non-Netanyahu option would be. And here we are a year later, and we're looking at another set of elections. The one thing, of course, that the most interesting piece of this election would be the Israeli Arabs. The fact that Israeli parties are considering governments on both sides are considering governments either with them or governments that would be supported by them from the outside is definitely a breakthrough, and could speak to the eventual inclusion of Israeli Arabs in the government. Again, I wouldn't get overly excited on the right, because one of the biggest issues that is likely to keep Netanyahu from being able to form a government would be the opposition of Smotrich to any government that has Israeli Arabs. That moves Netanyahu over to relying on Gideon Sa'ar, who won't join him, and now you start to see how the whole thing falls apart. And with that, I'm gonna, I think, move it over to Amy.
Tovah, thank you very much. Again, if you have questions, there is the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom panel, or chat it into Facebook. Amy, we turn to you for some opening comments.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I certainly agree with much of what Tovah said. We're, sort of seeing all these differing factions, but as she said, a lot of unity of thought, not necessarily of parties. I think no one right now in Israel can tell you what exactly will be the outcome of the election we had a month ago. The most likely outcome appears to be another election, probably sometime in September. But, there's so many other very out of the box possibilities that have been floated. After all these years covering Israeli politics, nothing would really surprise me. So even, these stories of Netanyahu potentially becoming president when Rivlin ends his term, or even some sort of deal to have Gideon Sa'ar become president, and therefore potentially the rest of his party would give support to Netanyahu, or, different factions getting together, or, specific members of Knesset from a party defecting, from one side to the other without the whole party. So, until the day that next election is called, I would not rule anything out. But obviously we've seen, this is the fourth election in 2 years. Everyone's keep wondering, how is this going to end? What's going to end this? And, obviously, as Tovah said, Netanyahu himself is one of the biggest, challenges, this opposition to him that comes from both the right and the left, which is causing his, inability to form a government. But it's also, everything over the past 2 years has raised a lot of questions about electoral reform in Israel and what could be changed about the system to prevent this from happening again and again. So, Israel actually did experiment briefly with, the direct election of the prime minister. There were 3 elections where that happened. I think it was 92 to 2001. And then it happened in part because of sort of a coalition quagmire trading different sides, but then eventually, discarded that. But obviously that would sort of potentially overcome some of these problems. There's obviously talk of term limits, which is something that's been talked about for years and years. And, there's that famous video of Netanyahu saying 20 years ago, 30 years ago, maybe, that he supports term limits. Obviously not exactly his position today. And then there's talk of the electoral threshold of whether raising it further would keep some of the smaller parties out and therefore potentially give them less power in this coalition building process. So it has been raised, and I think the most recent one was 6 or 7 years ago. It was raised to 3.25%. But you still have 13 parties in the Knesset, which is not a record, but it's not a small number of parties. And that's, obviously there are many parliamentary systems in the world, but few have as many parties in the body at one time, which is, a big part of how we have gotten to this situation. So things are never boring here in Israel. And I think everyone's sort of waiting to see what happens, and anyone who tells you they know exactly how things are going to play out, I wouldn't trust them. So we will see what happens, and happy to take questions from the audience.
Great. Amy, thank you. Thank you for those remarks. Let's touch on initially just kind of a couple things that you both talked about. And Tovah, we can start with you, but how much 4 elections in 2 years, how much of this is Netanyahu as a potential impediment to a government versus having a very solid base versus foundationally electoral reforms that need to be addressed within Israel? There's kind of competing ideas there. How would you measure those out, Tovah?
Oh, well, I mean, I think that if you have a country whose election process keeps sending you into elections, like where the option is to keep going, and remember, this has actually never happened before in Israeli history. So, that the system didn't envision this and have some kind of a safeguard against it. It could be anything, a prime minister who can't form a government after 2 times can't run again. It could be term limits. It could be, a way to solve the dispute, right? Either take any option. But if you don't, I think the first thing that would happen once there is a stable government is that they would have to create legislation that would keep this from happening, because the fact that there isn't a government right now, I'm not even sure the government can actually meet because, there's no justice minister. So, you just want to take a look at the fact that while we got the vaccines from Pfizer, we might not be able to continue to get them because we haven't paid the bill because, we don't have a functional government. It's, obviously we need reform. So that would be my absolute first question. After that, on one hand, you want to give Netanyahu credit, particularly weirdly in this last election, because if you want to say that he's the problem, he was also the most obvious choice, right? He came in at 30 mandates. Nobody even came close. It wasn't like it was 30 for Netanyahu and 29 for Lapid, or it wasn't like it was 30 for, if you remember originally when we started, people thought like Saar would take over, Bennett might take over. I mean, who knows, maybe Lapid could have taken over. That didn't happen. So Netanyahu came in at 30, right? And the next person after that is 17. So on one hand, he's still clearly a very popular leader, right? So then it gets down to personalities. Would this still exist if, he wasn't also on trial for, corruption charges? Unclear. I think it's partially him, but it's also partially not him. It's partially divisions in the right, partially not.
Great. Amy?
I definitely, agree with Tovah. It's a lot of different factors that have come together. I mean, there's talk now that, when the Knesset reconvenes, that there'll be a majority to pass a law that would bar, a prime minister who's been indicted from forming the government, which would sort of, solve these problems from both sides in a way. It would be both electoral reform and both clearly directed at Netanyahu. The chances of that happening, it would be, down to every single vote. And it's, unclear if that could go through. As Tovah said, Netanyahu is, there's a reason no one's replaced him for so long. And that's because he has, this popularity that no one else has really come close to. I mean, the first of 4 elections back in April 2019, the reason we ended up in a second election is almost not because of necessarily Netanyahu's corruption or even because of the challenge from Gantz, right? It was Lieberman, who everyone expected would go with Netanyahu, as he had many times in the past, and he's put his foot down and said, no, I'm done, I'm out. And then, that government never happened, and Gantz also, didn't have a chance. So, obviously, as Tovah said, Likud got 30 seats and Yesh Atid was behind, but not close with 17. But Blue and White, when it ran with Yesh Atid, so they got 35 and then we're down to 30 at one point. So combined this time, they'd still get 25, which is, not an insignificant number, but it does speak to that splintering of, the anti-Netanyahu bloc and the fact that they even then couldn't, stick together. Obviously that breakup was due to Netanyahu without a doubt. So it's definitely, all these factors play a big role.
So, Naftali Bennett is obviously a significant player in these discussions. He, on the one hand, he's talking to Netanyahu. He has also sought to replace him. And what we saw was that Benny Gantz, who had run vowing not to sit with Netanyahu, has paid a significant political price for ultimately sitting with him. Amy, let's start with you. If Bennett ultimately joins any sort of coalition with Netanyahu, will he pay a comparable or some different price for sitting with Netanyahu, or will he be able to ultimately turn that to some sort of advantage?
I think they're very different. Gantz, ran 3 election campaigns almost solely on the platform of not sitting with Netanyahu and replacing Netanyahu. So to then turn around and join his coalition was rightfully seen as a betrayal of, the voters. And Bennett, the whole campaign, he said, I'm running for prime minister, but he was also, he never once said, I won't sit with Netanyahu. He said, I want to replace him, but he always said, my goal is a stable right-wing government. And if, I need to join Netanyahu for a reason, then I would. So I don't think he would pay that price at all. And also, his voter base, a lot of them obviously have issues with Netanyahu, right? They voted for a candidate who said Netanyahu has failed. But at the same time, they're not as antagonistic as necessarily the Blue and White and the Yesh Atid voters, right? They're a more right-wing voter. They probably agree with a lot of Likud members of Knesset and values. And, I don't think, if it comes down to it, that, he would necessarily be harmed politically.
Tovah, Jody is asking just kind of a technical question. How can an MK flip from one party to another, having been elected on a slate with one party? So I know it's we're not something we're as used to seeing here in America, but it's more commonplace there. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So, it's my best understanding, right? So, you want to do that very carefully, because obviously if you ran on one platform and then you shift, you're going to lose a lot of voters in the next thing. But it's my understanding technically, I think that such a flip now comes at a price. That in fact, if you were to flip now, like, the whole stress on, whether one scenario is whether or not Bennett would join Netanyahu, and then whether or not Netanyahu could kind of convince, right, a number of people from Gideon Sa'ar's party to join him, or essentially split off, get 2 people from Gideon Sa'ar's party so that he would hit 61. They would be risking a lot. It's my understanding that should that happen, you could not run in the next Knesset unless you yourself formed a new party. So I think at this point, there's some laws in place to keep that from happening, since that did happen before.
Great, thank you. And Tovah, let me ask this to you as well. Debbie is asking, in American media, a lot of it is kind of BB versus not BB, but what are the actual policy issues or the top three issues per se that Israelis are going to the polls thinking about and making decisions about whom to vote based upon?
Oh, well, I think it's the global issue, right? So there's COVID, and then actually there's COVID. That's been on everybody's mind. That's been the top thing. When, Bennett, who is Netanyahu, who Bennett has gotten a lot of strength from the whole COVID issue. And Netanyahu initially lost a lot, right? Because initially it looked like Israel wasn't doing a good job. And it looked like it had been doing a good job when Bennett was there, and then he left. And then it seemed like, it was just one long disaster. And so then it seemed like it would almost be good to go to elections. It almost seemed like Bennett could even be the preferable choice. But then, it shifted because Netanyahu got the vaccines, and then he turned us into vaccination nation. And so the elections happened precisely at this fabulous point for him when we were just coming out of it. I think that's why he got the 30. I think people went to the polls and they voted vaccines. They're voting on the economy, and then they're voting on religious secular issues. Those would be my top three.
Amy, any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. COVID obviously, played a huge role in, the messages from every party we saw over the past year. And that was something that we heard from Bibi, repeatedly, that he brought vaccines, that he, led to, the situation we're in now, where we are largely, back to normal thanks to those vaccines. But at the same time, Bennett, who was criticizing Netanyahu from the right, really slammed his, not the vaccines, but the other, his other decisions over COVID, things about the airport and about schooling and, all sorts of things. And that's, and he really hit him on that. But, the Likud got 30 seats and Bennett got 7. So, if that was the battle, then people certainly seem to side with Netanyahu over his approach to COVID.
Right. Amy, I'll start with you also. We have seen attempt after attempt from the center left to dethrone Netanyahu, but ultimately unable to do so. Why do you think that there is such a challenge to build that center left majority in the Knesset to get to 61 seats? And what do you think they might need to think about doing ultimately to change that if there were to be a fifth election?
The fact of the matter is Israel is not a center-left country. Israel is a center-right country. There just isn't that huge voter base. And, the closest it came was when blue and white, came together and had that coalition of factions. But, these labels center-left, center-right, they're somewhat broad and somewhat meaningless. But, if you look at blue and white, right, it's like 4 IDF generals, and you had Moshe Ya'alon, who is from Likud, who's certainly not a leftist by any stretch of the imagination, right? He opposes a Palestinian state, and he was high up on the blue and white list. Israelis, there's always going to be a dedicated Meretz and labor voters, and those parties have been around for a long time, and they're, even when people declare their death, they're still here and in the Knesset, but the majority is just not where that is. And so, that's why blue and white came closest, when they positioned themselves, in the center. When it comes to issues of security, which is a big part of the left-right divide in Israel, the policy positions of blue and white versus Likud were never all that different. Israelis are not particularly looking for, a left-wing security position. And that is often, one of the biggest things that people go to the votes for. And, left-wing issues that are in the United States, viewed as left-wing, which is sort of like welfare issues and things like that. Those are more mainstream, right? Israel is a very different dynamic in terms of those issues. And so they're not seen as a left-right divide. They're much more uniform. And so, I don't know what I would say to center-left parties trying to get there, other than, it's pretty unlikely that we're going to see something like that.
Tovah, Netanyahu obviously has long-standing relationships with American officials, has known now President Biden for a significant period of time. what would it do? We're getting a question from Jason. What would it do to the U.S.-Israel relationship if Netanyahu were not the prime minister and were replaced with whether it's Bennett or Lapid or whomever? How would that change the issues as we discuss the U.S.-Israel relationship?
Well, first of all, Biden, as you know, has a long-standing relationship with Israel, right? I mean, he says that, you know, he's known every prime minister since Golda Meir, and he likes to tell a lot of stories about that. So I think that Biden's relationship is with Israel. It doesn't matter who the prime minister is. And you want to sort of look at the little move today where when he wanted to, you know, when he wanted to call Israel, he actually didn't call Netanyahu, he called a reporter from Israel to, you know, as by way of wishing Israelis, you know, happy Independence Day. I think that, you know, that there is an inherent tension that will obviously be built in between Netanyahu and Biden, but that of course would be true if Bennett were prime minister, or much less true, obviously, with Lapid. So I'm going to stick with Bennett for a second, or Netanyahu. I think this stress is there. The advantage of Netanyahu is that Netanyahu knows Biden very, very well. The two of them know each other. So Netanyahu's ability to manage a situation with Biden, to sort of, for the two of them to kind of outthink each other, you know, it's best that situation is best with Netanyahu. Obviously, a Lapid-led government, should that occur, would be an easier one. A left-leaning one would be easier, because a lot of the tensions that are going to come up are going to be around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But the biggest tension is really going to be around Iran. And there you're going to get, you know, almost straight across the board, you know, thinking, no matter who it is. So I still think that in some ways, Netanyahu still might bring a lot to the table in that regard.
Amy, Tovah mentioned Iran, and you just spoke about the center left versus the right. On Iran, are there real policy disagreements from any of the parties more broadly amongst the electorate that they would run on as a platform, or is there real consensus on this issue?
There's broad consensus, but it doesn't mean there aren't disagreements. There's certainly disagreements in terms of approach to the Americans over how best to, you know, deal with the Biden administration that's now obviously seeking, you know, to re-enter the deal. You know, there's a former IDF general who's in Meretz, you know, and he's written op-eds about how he supports going back into the deal, whereas obviously Netanyahu has very forcefully said otherwise. But in terms of, you know, the mainstream parties, you know, I don't think the general approach is any different. You know, obviously everyone in Israel does not want to see Iran get a nuclear bomb. That's the broadest consensus you can have. And you know, there are more in terms of more, you know, details over how to approach the negotiations and how to approach the U.S. administration. You'll see differences, but it's not, you know, I don't think it's an issue anyone went to the polls based on. I don't think anyone said, well, I'm going to vote for Yair Lapid because I agree with his approach on the Iran issue.
Great. Tovah, in America, there's a lot of conversation about the relationship between media and politics. We've seen in Israel as well, some of media coverage become politicized as well. Would love your thoughts on where that relationship or how that's being discussed today.
You mean in terms of, well, you know, I think that Netanyahu likes to present himself as the victim of the media, obviously, right? There is a general sense in Israel that the media is to the left. And so as the government moves to the right, then the presumption is that the media has almost been left behind, right? That it doesn't, you know, that it no longer represents the people, that it represents its own agenda. Netanyahu would like to have you believe that part of his problem is in fact the media, and that, you know, the media in some ways is the enemy. I think that as discord moves more out of fashion, then there is increased, you know, pressure to present a more uniformed front that supports a more right-wing agenda versus a left-wing agenda. But I mean, clearly, within that scenario, if the idea is that the media is left and the media is influencing politics, then clearly the media is losing because the voters are going to the polls and voting right.
Amy, just that relationship between media and politics in Israel, do you believe that's having an increasing impact on the results that we're seeing in Israeli elections? So again, if there were to be a fifth election, is this a trend that over time we should be paying attention to and will have an impact?
I mean, I think like we see in the US and Israel, there's also an increasing distrust of the media. And, there was this very surreal situation last week where at the same time that all the parties were meeting with Rivlin to recommend a candidate for prime minister, Netanyahu was in a court in Jerusalem, at the start of witnesses for his trial. And the issue that was on the agenda that day was him improperly influencing the media. And there are all these accusations with Walla, which is a prominent news outlet, that he forced them to, through other, it's a convoluted case, but, forced them to provide positive coverage. So situations like that, and that case certainly doesn't lead to greater trust in the media. So, it's hard to draw a certain line. I think overall people, are not trusting. And as we go through all these elections over and over again, I think people are just fed up with both the media and with the political system. And, I think that just leads to this breakdown in trust more generally.
Tovah, Avi is asking about an increased Arab diplomatic presence in Jerusalem, maybe through the normalization agreements, and how that might ultimately impact Israeli-Palestinian relations, or a path forward on that front. Is there a correlation there?
You mean between the normalization deals and the Israeli-Arab conflict?
I think he's asking, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think, look, that's the hope, right? The hope is that as Israel normalizes relations with the Arab countries, particularly if Israel is able to increase the number of those deals, right? It's hard to sort of be anti-Israel when the Arab nations are for Israel, and so the idea is that the Arab nations would then pressure the Palestinians to come to the table. I think the problem right now is nobody can go to any table because there really isn't a government in Israel. And then after that, there really isn't a government, among the Palestinians either, because there's going to be an election. So if you wanted to start to try and resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, remember there was a time where we wanted Netanyahu to come to the table. We wanted the Palestinians to come to the table. The question is, why weren't they coming to the table? And Netanyahu used to say, to Abbas, just, I'll go to Ramallah, come to Jerusalem. That isn't happening now because there aren't two governments that can negotiate. Before you can start to negotiate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you actually need a stable government in Israel and you need a stable Palestinian government. And the leadership election among the Palestinians isn't happening until the summer. There's a legislative elections in May. So you're looking at the fall before you have any possibility of any kind of resumption of a peace process. And then after that, you have to have a US president that is even thinking along those lines. So yes, I think long term, absolutely, it will have an impact. And I think it does have an impact, particularly with BDS. But in terms of resolving the Palestinian conflict, you have to resolve the governmental crises among both Israelis and Palestinians, or you can't get anywhere.
Great, thank you. Amy?
Yeah, I certainly agree with what Tovah said. The Palestinian elections that are slated for this summer are still in question. Everyone sort of believes that Abbas might call them off at the last minute if he doesn't like how things are looking to turn out. The more people join the race against him, the less likely everyone seems to think it will happen. But, we've seen from the Biden administration that it's not a high priority. It's not something he's looking to leave his mark on from everything we've seen so far. Obviously, that could change in the next few years. And, Israel can't even pass its own budget. So the idea that we're going to enter into some sort of major negotiations now, I know the quartet recently had a meeting to say, oh, we're starting small steps. And, it's not high on the minds of most people here.
We talked about this a little earlier. Larry's asking kind of a follow-on of the electoral reforms that could come before the Knesset. We can start with you. What do you think is the most likely? Are we talking, is it an effort to return to direct elections? Is it raising the Knesset threshold? Is it term limits? What is the most, or is it not being able to form a government if you're under indictment? What are the most likely that we would be looking at and hearing about?
Yeah, I mean, the one that's being talked about now is, passing some sort of law to prevent someone under indictment from forming the government. As I said in my introduction, it's possible, but it would be very narrow and be very tight, and it would be very contentious. And it's not clear at all it would have a majority, even as the quote unquote change camp in Israel, does have more seats. In terms of, direct elections, I don't think anyone in Israel is seriously considering going back to that. I don't think it was considered a successful experiment. There's a lot of things and a lot of think tanks that are being floated. And, again, a lot of them, it's not clear, right? If you raise the electoral threshold, will that make things easier or will it not? So it's hard for me to see anything progressing. Israel often can be slow on these things. We're the startup nation, but we still put a slip of paper in a cardboard box for our voting, right? It seems pretty backwards to a lot of people. So again, there's only that one that's being seriously considered now, but nothing appears, really on the horizon immediately.
Tovah, any additional thoughts or disagreement?
Oh, I agree. I agreed with Amy. Definitely. I think I'm just going to say one line and then move on, which is, I think the anti-Netanyahu camp has done a very good job of painting the problem as being Netanyahu. So the first legislation that would go into place would be to get somebody else into Likud and to get Netanyahu out. And I don't know that people have galvanized beyond any other ideas.
Got it. If we were to go to a fifth election, what do you think would be the things that might fundamentally change the results and the ability to form a government coming out of the fifth election, as opposed to where we are today and where we've been for the last couple of years? Tovah, we can start with you this time.
Well, every election is a gamble, right? You don't know that the whole way that it turned out before is how it's gonna turn out now. And the biggest gamble really now is COVID. So COVID has really been Netanyahu's ticket in this election. And if it's true that we really don't pay Pfizer, if we don't have vaccines, if the vaccine doesn't work on a variant, if we have to go to another shutdown, if the economy tanks, then Netanyahu's support could drop to a point where you could coalesce. In other words, he's very close, to forming 61, but he's not there. And you just need a few shifts in a few patterns of votes in another party, and it could be, a natural formation of another government. I think particularly since now there's a lot of disagreement about this, but it would just be my opinion that if you've now broken the taboo of bringing in Israeli Arab parties, then that is something that could happen also in the next election. And I think it's something that people could run on more actively to kind of change the dynamic. One of the things that certainly has created a gridlock in the system is this assumption that you can't have Israeli Arabs in the government, right? Because then you take out already 10 or sometimes as much as 15 seats from contention. You're really actually working out of a field of 95. But what if you were actually working out of the whole field of 120? So that would be a very different dynamic. It would also shift things more center left. And once Netanyahu has said I can run with his, I can have a government that depends on or could include Israeli Arabs, then anyone can do it.
It's a great point. Amy, feelings on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've long learned not to be in the business of predictions. And, even if you're talking about a fifth election in September, that's sort of like years away in Israeli political terms, and so many things can happen. One thing that a lot of people are looking at is that, the deal that Netanyahu and Benny Gantz signed when they formed their government last year means that Gantz will become the prime minister on November 17th if no other government has replaced that government. So if we go to another election in the fall and there's still no government by November 17th, Benny Gantz is expected to become the prime minister. So that's something that could put a wrench in a lot of plans, because then it would mean that, moving forward, the same reason we've seen Netanyahu stay prime minister through the past 3 elections is because, the caretaker government stays in place until something comes to replace it. So if Gantz is that person in November 17th, it'll certainly, change the situation, and anything is possible.
So in that scenario, Tovah, if once Netanyahu is no longer prime minister, who on the right is potentially the greatest beneficiary? Is it Gideon Sa'ar? Is it Bennett? Is there an effort to retake Likud, for one of them to reconquer Likud in a post-Netanyahu era? How might that play itself out?
Well, it depends when and how, right? But in terms of heirs to Netanyahu, I think within the Likud, you're looking at Nir Barkat, somebody who isn't really, on the scene right this moment, as a fairly good contender. It wouldn't necessarily be Bennett or Gideon Sa'ar. I think Gideon Sa'ar in particular has shown that he does not have a huge appeal among Likud voters, or he would have done much better. And Bennett is both. I would say that both those men are creating bases that still have not really touched the center of the Likud. So I think it will be somebody, not those two, who comes in from Likud, and within that, I would be seriously looking at Nir Barkat.
Amy, post Netanyahu on the right, some of these parties have come about because Netanyahu has held off on having a successor, on keeping the bench shallow, and they haven't had opportunities. What do you think happens on the right in a post Netanyahu era?
Yeah, I mean, as Tovah said, I think it leads, more to, an easier coalescence around a figure. Nir Barkat, certainly one name that comes up a lot. He was the mayor of Jerusalem for a long time. He was a very well-known national figure. Gideon Sa'ar was sort of seen as the big loser of this election, right? He launched his campaign with a lot of big names behind him, a lot of prominent Likud members, and said, I'm here to replace Netanyahu, and wound up with, I believe it's 6 seats. So, and he himself admitted, his campaign failed. The question of whether or not he, attempts to come back into Likud from that point, he's obviously burned some bridges, but we've seen, in Israeli history, people have pretty short memories. Kadima obviously split off a lot of Likud members, and a lot of them ended up going back. This isn't new ground, so it's certainly possible for, if not Gideon Sa'ar himself, but other people on his list to eventually go back. Bennett worked with Netanyahu in the past, but I don't believe he was ever, he was certainly never in the Knesset with Likud. So he's always been, in this, his own party, which has changed composition many times over the years, but it'll be something to watch. And it's, a question certainly happening within Likud itself.
We're getting a couple questions. We'll start with Amy for both of you. Gary Allen and Joy are asking, it's Yom HaAtzmaut, we're at the cusp of Yom HaAtzmaut, the 73rd anniversary. And on the one hand, Israel is stuck in this kind of intractable election cycle, Groundhog Day feeling. On the other hand, the vaccination nation, as Tovah mentioned earlier, is an incredible success story. So there's kind of disparate ideas about being stuck, but also having incredible innovation and progress. What, as Israel goes into the next year of existence, what's the national mood like? How do Israelis feel about their country, the challenges they face, and the opportunities that are presented? Amy, I'll start with you.
Yeah. I don't think the average Israeli wakes up and says, oh, this political gridlock is so terrible, right? It's not, it's embarrassing and people are frustrated, but it's not necessarily the most, forefront issue. I think people, we're starting tonight to celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut, and people are remembering last year, right? When we didn't leave our homes, all the public celebrations were canceled. Everything was, either virtual or, you could look out your window for fireworks, and even some of the fireworks were canceled because people didn't, cities didn't want people to gather. So people are certainly remembering that and how far we've come today, 1 year later, largely thanks to the vaccines. And so I think people are optimistic that, we'll continue on that trend. Obviously, there are concerns, there's questions, there's variants, et cetera. I think the political situation is frustrating. We very interestingly, we saw in the 3 elections, right, April, September, March, that turnout did go slightly up each one, and then this time it went back down again. So, it's hard to ascribe exact motivations for that, but things like weather can play a role, and COVID may have played a role, but overall, people are deeply frustrated. The government is stuck. It's not functioning. The Knesset's not functioning. Diplomacy is suffering. So those are concerns, but the day-to-day is always going to be about, are my kids in school, right? Are we able to go to the stores? Are we able to hang out with our friends? And excuse me, sorry. And on that front, people are much more optimistic than we were a year ago. That's for sure.
Tovah?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with a lot of what Amy said. I just want to add in 1 or 2 very quick things, but won't repeat. I think one of the amazing things about Israel is that it always feels like it's both a miracle and on the edge of disaster at the same time, right? Like, so you turn around and you think, oh my God, Iran, COVID, the economy, and then you kind of go, okay, but we're a nation that rose out of the ashes of the Holocaust against impossible odds, and we're still here, and so you bring all of those into Independence Day, just as an add-on. If you want to move on to the next question.
No, it's great, thank you. I know no one wants to prognosticate, but if you had a guess, in 6 months, who would be the prime minister of Israel, or who would be sitting in the prime minister's seat, whether it's a caretaker government or a new government? We won't hold you to it, although it will live on in infamy and public record. Amy, who would you say is sitting in that chair?
6 months, is that after November 17th? What are we in May now?
Hold on, I have to check the calendar. April, yes, let's say we're after. Let's say November 19th. Here, we'll forget
November
6 months.
19th.
November 19th, 2021. Amy.
As I've already said, I'm not in the business of predictions. There's nothing I want to be held to. If I had to guess, Netanyahu has come from behind, almost every time, for so long. It's hard to imagine an Israel without Netanyahu in leadership for, most of my adult life. He's been the prime minister. So somehow he always seems to pull it out. And I would not be shocked if that was the case in 6 months as well. But as I said, anything is possible.
Tovah, November 19th, 2021.
I think Netanyahu is still your best guess, but I wouldn't put money on it. I would duck any attempt to corner me on that one. I think, look, what I said before, is this storyline here really changes on a dime. You've got Iran, you've got Hamas in Gaza, you've got COVID, you've got Palestinian elections. These are all variables that will shift the equation in any second, in Netanyahu's favor or not in his favor. So yeah, best bets on Netanyahu, but I'm not putting money on it.
Great. And say Harvey, we got a question coming in. Harvey is asking, is there anything in the charges against Netanyahu or the trial that you think is potentially outside of a conviction that would fundamentally change how the electorate feels about him continuing to sit in the prime minister's office? Tovah, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I don't think so, in part because it's what's been most amazing is how little the trial has actually impacted, the electorate in some ways. It hasn't been the biggest issue on the agenda. So it would have to be something that we can't imagine. But as it goes, no, I think the bigger issue is simply the time constraints of doing both things at once. But the actual idea of a prime minister, that is under a corruption charge, I think somehow Israelis adjusted to that.
So unless Tovah touched on it, the contents of the trial haven't seemed to move the electorate, but the time constraint and the ability to do both jobs at once, is that something that potentially would impact how the electorate feels about Netanyahu in office, or something he would be able to continue to manage?
It's a question he's faced already, right? We've had multiple elections where either, he was on trial or we were moving towards that, and there were pretrial hearings, and there were, questions of, can you do both at the same time? And he's always brushed that off. Also, everything we're hearing from the trial, some of the details are new, but overall, right, the media has been covering this story for years and years, and the investigations and leaks and all these sorts of things. So the things coming up are not particularly new. And, as Tovah said, we've, it's sort of it doesn't faze people, right? You see international headlines about, Netanyahu on trial, but, still has the biggest party. And in Israel, it's sort of like, well, yeah, of course, this is how we expected it. No one thought that following the indictment in this election, he would somehow, become a non-factor. It was never a question.
I guess, Lucien, is there something for both of you, quickly, something that we didn't talk about, something we didn't ask about, that you think our audience and folks who care about these issues should be paying attention to or watching for as an indicator of where the wind might shift? Amy, I guess we'll start with you as we start to close out.
I'm trying to think. We've obviously covered a lot of ground. I think, listen, American audiences are sort of used to an election happens and we have results and we know who won. And obviously that's very much not the case here. It hasn't been in the case in Israel, for a long time, and specifically over the past 2 years, it obviously hasn't been the case. That being said, we're now in this position of coalition negotiations, right? I believe there's 20 days left for Netanyahu's mandate, and he can ask for a 2-week extension, but Rivlin really made it pretty clear that he was highly unlikely to grant that. So, there's a lot of negotiations going on, and as we said, Netanyahu is this political mastermind. He's always sort of managed to pull these things off. And 20 days, and anything could happen, really. We'll see what kind of deals he tries to pull, or whether or not it's actually in his best interest to go to fifth election, and sort of remain, once again, the prime minister, throughout his trial, and stay in that position. So, timing, as we talked about with the trial and with the coalition talks, is key. And then whatever Rivlin will do, when those 20 days are up, is also a big question, right? Whether or not he'll give it to Lapid or to Bennett or straight to the Knesset, will be something to watch and sort of see what those next steps are.
Thank you. Tovah, something we're not talking about today that we should be, or something that we'll be talking about in a couple of months that no one has thought about today?
Yeah, we're going to be talking about the Palestinian elections, or we're going to be talking about the impact of what's happening in the Palestinian territories on the entire equation. We're going to be talking more about Iran. We're going to be talking more about the economy. I think that as we move forward, Netanyahu's, I think through all of this, Netanyahu's ability to lead, to be a popular Israeli leader has been very clear. But as you move forward, his ability to govern without a government, gets harder. So if we do move into the fifth elections, I think you will see him and other politicians needing to make more compromises than maybe they've been forced to make before, in order to just kind of put, a government in place, or kind of face, the consequences of the absence of one, the Pfizer vaccine thing being just the latest the latest example.
Amy and Tovah, thank you so much for your time today and for this incredible conversation. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions. Please feel free to continue reaching out. We're happy to provide answers and get other information for you. To close us out today, it's my pleasure to turn us over to our other DMFI board co-chair, Todd Richmond. Todd, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you, Elliot. Amy and Tovah, that was awesome. I was glued to my Zoom on every word that both of you spoke. Thank you so much. I mean, I wake up every morning to my Jewish Insider email, and then I go right to jpost.com. So it's always good to be able to see and hear the faces and the comments of reporters from two publications that I love and follow on a daily basis. So thank you so much, and great job, Elliot, on your navigating through all those tough questions. I wanted to do a quick welcome to Macy Schiff, who is a new person on the DMFI staff who's going to be working with our digital footprint. So I want to say a quick welcome to Macy. As many of you know, DMFI has done a lot over the last couple of years, and we have much more to go and much more to do, whether it's dealing with the Biden administration and our friends in Congress on critical issues such as Iran, USA to Israel, and building on Israeli normalization agreements with her neighbors. And being successful in those areas requires us to continue to do a lot of work to ensure that the Democratic Party remains strongly pro-Israel. And DMFI is the only organization that is focused on and dedicated to achieving that goal. But we cannot do this without your support and from the people who care about these issues like you do. So we are asking you to help us achieve those goals. And while you are sitting in front of your screen, go to dmfi.org to sign up for more invitations, some more information and other programs, and of course to donate to DMFI. And if you want to learn more about DMFI and how you can get involved, you can reach out to us through the website or send us an email at info@dmfi.org. So on behalf of my fellow co-chair, Ann Lewis, and my fellow board members, and our amazing CEO and president of DMFI, Mark Melman, and the entire staff, we want to thank you again for taking the time out of your busy schedule to learn about what's going on. And we also want to wish Israel a happy Independence Day. And once again, Amy and Tovah, phenomenal job. Thank you so much for doing today's Zoom. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us, Tovah and Amy. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thank you.
All the best. And Hag Sameach.